Welcome to RPG Heroes, a podcast where every other week I speak to a true hero in the realm of role-playing games about their journey, their craft, and their views. As your host, I will focus on one particular aspect of this wonderful hobby for the interview, regale you with stories from my own 25 years of experience with role-playing games, and reflect on the major takeaways from the interview. Join me now on this epic journey and awaken the hero in you. Episode 5, everyone, and today's theme is world building. So, if you're interested in creating your very own world for your role-playing games, well, then stick around. And even if you're not interested in creating it yourself, well, you might learn a thing or two about how these things are created for you and why it happens the way it happens, and also how players can be involved in this process. Today's guest is Keith Baker. He's a game designer best known for creating the game world of Eberron for Dungeons & Dragons. Before we start, just a few quick things. I would like to thank people for interacting more and more with my Facebook page. Michalis Mandelaras has been commenting quite a lot. Thank you so much for your input. And also, I saw a comment by Mike Mason, somebody who's on my list to interview later. Also, really exciting, episode 1 with Runehammer has now passed the 200 downloads mark. That is amazing. Alright, enough of this, let's get into it. So, world building. It is something you come across quite a lot once you get interested in role-playing games, because every single role-playing game takes place in a certain world, and you definitely need some sort of information about the world that your story is going to take place in. Otherwise, the characters don't have any context. Many games come with their own world attached, which is handy, or you can buy boxed sets of different worlds for a particular game. Dungeons & Dragons is a great example of this. There are many different worlds that you can purchase as a boxed set for your stories to take place in. My own experience with world building is a little bit limited, I have to say. Most of the time, I prefer to make use of existing worlds that you can simply buy, or the worlds that come with the game itself. Time has often been a limiting factor in my willingness and also ability to create my own game world, and also the feeling that other people are simply more creative or better suited to actually creating all this cool stuff. And I preferred to dwell on the story and make use of somebody else's work as a backdrop, as the context for the story. The first time I actually experienced world building, funny enough, was as a player, not as a game master. Because we were playing a game of 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons in the Planescape setting at the time, and the character of one of my friends became more and more powerful until towards the end of the campaign he was godlike. And we decided, let's switch roles, and that guy became the game master for our next campaign. And he said, you know what? I'm going to run a campaign in a world where that particular character actually became a god of his own world. And he started to model that world around that character as a god. Super interesting. And of course, it all began as a few notes on paper and a map and that kind of stuff. And it got built out more and more. And he had to create his own pantheon of gods around this single god called Brian of Baldar. And the campaign world itself then became known as Baldar. And we had endless campaigns in that particular world. And actually that world went through a few iterations after apocalyptic events kind of reshaped his world. And every single time, the gods that he created and the main themes of the world that he created, they returned in a slightly different form. And we had the most memorable moments in that particular campaign setting, in that world, and very memorable NPCs and gods, and I can still name them today, which is amazing when you think about it, if you see how long ago this was. And what's cool as well is that we as players had a certain level of input in his world. So for instance, if I wanted to play a paladin in his world, well, then he needed to be following some sort of god, and we had to kind of work out the details of the religion and the clergy and all these type of things, which is cool. The first time I started to create my own world was when I was playing Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, and I was going to run a game for my friends in Belfast. And I decided, let's create my own world because I have certain ideas that I want to try out. And the way that I did it was I started with a title. So I said, I want to call this campaign The Wounded Planet. And I had this vision of a planet with a giant gash just along the equator. And this gash was, of course, a gash all the way down to the center of the planet, so lots of lava and that kind of stuff. And it's quite a wide gash also, which created an interesting situation where people to the south of this chasm had no idea what was going on to the north of it and vice versa. And also it created an interesting point for the players about halfway to 2/3 in the campaign to try and cross it, because this was something considered in that game world to be impossible. They managed, of course. So step 1 for me was the title, and step 2 was the map. Now, of course, the entire world map is something that takes forever to make, and it needs quite a lot of detailed work. But what I did was I sketched a very rough map with a couple of key locations and, of course, that chasm in the middle. And I then traced a kind of interesting route between all these key places, and I thought, well, if the players make certain choices, then they will probably go past A, B, and C, or maybe they do it in a different order. But towards the idea of the campaign, of the story, was going to be that they would travel eventually past all these important places to pick up, the MacGuffin, and then finish the game on the other side of the chasm. And the chasm played a central role in the story as well. And the advantage of creating a map for me was that it allowed me to think in a visual way. I'm a very visual thinker, and it helped me to create a narrative around this idea of the chasm in the middle. It allowed me to think about why is it there, how was it created, and how does that impact the world. I also created a pantheon for that world, specifically because the story centered around the religion, the gods of that particular world. Because the players were tasked with the rather important task of bringing a reborn god back to where he needed to be to ascend to his proper place. In the end, I would never really be able to publish my campaign world, not in its current state anyway, and the reason is that I developed exactly what I needed for my sessions and nothing more, except for some vague outlines. And I think this is a key aspect of world building for RPGs. If it's just for your home game, that you end up developing mostly what you need. So in the beginning, you could start off with a small area, a village and the surrounding lands, and build it out from there, unless you have some grand scheme in mind like my Wounded Planet. Now, so much for my limited experience with all this. There are all kinds of resources these days that you can use to help you with your world building, and I'll list some of them right now, and of course links will be found in the show notes, and they are most easily accessed through my website at Buzzsprout, rather than through iTunes or whatever tool you're using to listen to this. And starting off this particular list is the world building playlist on YouTube by a channel called Great GM. And Guy, who runs this channel, will actually be one of my future guests on the show, somewhere in April, I would think. So make sure you go and check it out. I found it very helpful. He tends to really unpack things to a very detailed level. That's why it's a playlist rather than just one video. And he always has very concrete, practical advice. And speaking of Guy, if you're looking to create a world and you want to start with the narrative, with the story, the campaign that you want to run, and then build the world around that, what you could do is you could pick up a book that he wrote, which is The Complete Guide to Creating Epic Campaigns. And I've got the book right here in my hands. It's lovely, 140 pages with lots and lots of detailed information, exercises, charts, etc. that you can use to develop a really epic campaign. And that can help you to create a world that goes with it. And I've provided you with a link in the show notes, of course. The second thing I would like to point out is Immersive World Building, which is a video from World Anvil on YouTube. Now, World Anvil, this is not a sponsored thing, so don't worry. But World Anvil is a website where you can do a lot of your world building. It's a tool specifically made for that, for authors, but also for people who play role playing games. And the cool thing about World Anvil, I find, is that you can link articles and all these things together. You can link to locations on your map that you can just simply click and say, oh, this is where this happened, or this is where this NPC lives, etc. And you can decide what areas of your world you want to share with your players, so that they also have a reference tool between games. Yeah, and so if you haven't already, check it out. You can use it for free, and if you want to use the more advanced features, of course, there are some subscriptions that you can get. Then there is a video from WASD20, also on YouTube, who is actually my next guest. So in 2 weeks' time, you're going to be able to listen to my interview with him about maps. He participated in the hashtag My 30-Day World Challenge, which came from Tabletop World. And he talks about it in his YouTube video, how he managed the whole world building aspect. And speaking of Tabletop World, well, like I said, they had a hashtag My 30-Day World Challenge that came with some kind of Kickstarter they did. And if you go to that website, which again is linked in the show notes, you will see lots of really handy questions that you can ask yourself when you're trying to build your world. Then two more. One is nerd sourced. They have an article called 5 World Building Tips, which are really very useful. And the last one is Wolfgang Bauer. Has some things to say on world building on the website slyflourish.com. And of course, if you Google this, you'll find dozens more. And now let's see what a real authority on the topic of world building has to say about it. So, welcome to the show, Keith Baker. Keith Baker is a game designer and a fantasy novel author. I would say he's most famous for creating the Eberron campaign setting for Dungeons and Dragons. But if you look up information about him, you'll find lots and lots and lots and, oh my God, lots of projects around role-playing games that he has been involved in, including things for Goodman Games, Paizo, and Green Ronin Games.
Indeed.
Yeah, and your most famous creation, I would say, the Eberron campaign setting. It's seen widespread use in 3rd, 4th, and now 5th edition of D&D. How cool is that?
It's very cool.
Yeah,
I just have to say, I started playing D&D when I was 9 or 10, and I always wanted to be a writer.
yeah,
I knew that people write these games.
yeah,
Someone gets that job, but the idea that people would be playing in something I had created all over the world,
yeah.
I could never have hoped
No.
for that. It's amazing.
And the way it came about also, I think, is worth mentioning. So for those listeners who don't know this, back in 2002, I think it was, Wizards of the
2003.
Coast. Oh, 2003, yeah. So Wizards of the Coast said, hey, we need a new campaign setting. Why don't you guys, as in all the players of the game, come up with something cool? And they got something like 11,000 entries.
Yep.
And yeah, you made it to number 1.
Yeah, no. And so basically the initial pitch, it was just everyone sent in a one-page description of a world.
Uh-huh.
What's the basic idea? What's cool about it? Who are the heroes? They got over 11,000, but not all of them, sort of followed the rules. So
Right,
11,000 entries. They picked 11 of those, and from there you had to write a 10-page version, like
right.
add more detail, give a little
Uh-huh.
more what it's about. They picked 3 of those, and at that point, they did bring us up to Wizards and basically say, "Well, here's what we like and don't particularly like about your idea,"
Yeah,
and you had to make 100-page story bible.
okay.
And then from that, they picked Eberron, and
Yeah,
thereon, I went up, worked with the team up there. We created the Eberron campaign setting
yeah,
book, and basically the setting as you know it now. I mean,
yeah.
my 100-page description was not Eberron as you know it. That
Oh.
really emerged from working together with James Wyatt, Chris Perkins, and Bill Slavisek.
Right. Okay. And what would you say is the biggest difference between your 100-page write-up and the current world that we see?
One of the biggest things is my original design was larger. in
Mm.
terms of the world. It just had more countries and such, because
Yeah.
frankly, it was a slightly more realistic, view. There's a lot of
Yeah.
countries in the world.
Yeah.
But part of it is they knew they've done this before, and as it is, even with the world sort of reduced in scope, we still haven't had time to like really delve into uh, a lot of the countries in it in as much depth as I'd like. So it was definitely a
Right.
smart decision.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's also just a bunch of like little things, halflings on dinosaurs, which are certainly one of my favorite things.
Yeah.
That was something that evolved in those early discussions.
Yeah. Yeah.
That the planes were always nomadic halflings.
Mm.
But I remember we were sitting around in the room basically saying, well, how can we make these guys a little more exciting? Well, what
Yeah.
are they actually riding? Like we've said, they're
Yeah.
nomads.
Uh-huh.
How about dinosaurs?
Yeah.
Boom, and so it's things like that where it's
Yeah.
not that the world really dramatically changed, but still a lot of the sort of really exciting pieces are
Mm.
something that we all built together.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess that really helps to be able to bounce ideas off each other, etc. Because
Absolutely.
at some point,
Now, I
when
always
things,
think that collaboration really is one of the biggest things,
mm,
especially because, frankly, to me, the best part of D&D is the collaboration between players and game masters,
yeah,
and uh, people working together create fun things.
yeah, yeah, I totally agree. I was just going to say that even as something as simple as an adventure that you write as a game master, you it doesn't really get as cool as it's going to be until the players have interacted with it and um,
In 2009, I traveled around the world
mm,
running a particular Eberron adventure
right,
with all sorts of different people, and
mm.
I ran that adventure. At this point, I've run it 59 times,
Oh my god,
and every time it's different. Like I
yeah,
would love to run it a 60th time because it's flexible enough in its design
mm,
that basically I'm always interested to see what the players come up with, because every
yeah,
time I've run it, there's been something
yeah,
that has never been done before, or at least not in that combination.
yeah,
And that's what I love. I love
yeah,
that even again, having run this adventure so many times, it's still fun for me
yeah.
because I want to see what these players will do with it.
Yeah. And do you find when you travel across the world playing D&D with people that the place where you go changes how people play? Is there like a big difference between, let's say, American and European or?
Somewhat. It's certainly something. I wrote a couple of articles about it. Really what was most interesting to me is it's the difference between playing with a group of friends and playing with a group of strangers at a
Uh,
convention.
yeah.
And part of what I really enjoyed about the experience I had was just getting to see different groups of players and
Ah,
what brought them together and why
yeah.
they play D&D. And so that's what I'm saying is I wouldn't necessarily say there's a consistent Bulgarians are more aggressive D&D players
No,
than Ukrainians or something like that.
no, no.
But definitely the stories of how did these people start playing
Mm,
role-playing games? Why did they play role-playing games? Those were both interesting and definitely very different in some countries from others.
yeah, yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Okay.
I think my favorite story that came out of all of that was in Bulgaria,
Mm,
and how things started there was uh, a student at a university who was working on translating English works.
mm.
Someone gave them a copy of D&D.
Ah,
Like a box set. They translated, they shared it with friends. It spread out from patient zero,
yeah.
but the biggest thing at that point was they didn't have dice,
Ah,
because polyhedral dice, I mean, they're not actually something you can just cannibalize from a different game.
no, no.
This was before internet, Amazon. And so dice were very rare. Some people made them, like,
Mm.
made them out of wood. Someone made a set out of dental enamel. Whenever someone left the country, they'd be like, bring back dice,
Oh yeah.
and like stuff like that.
Yeah.
But that dice were this definitely like commodity that like each group of players like had one set of dice.
Ah,
And just thinking to my growing up, where I had buckets of dice,
yeah.
and all of this, just the idea of the people huddling around there, oh, we only have 1d4,
Yeah, yeah.
is just a very different experience.
That's really cool. Yeah. Yeah, because I find nowadays the people are almost like dice collectors. If you
Yeah,
look
yeah.
on, for instance, Instagram, the most accounts that have looked for me when I started my Instagram account for the podcast is dice producers.
Mhm, mhm.
It's
No,
crazy these
absolutely.
days. Yeah.
And certainly now, situation's completely different now. And,
Mm,
there's
yeah.
a game store in Sophia when I was there, but it was just, again, the story of how did it get there?
Yeah.
How did
Yeah.
things start? And that was very interesting.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, so you created this campaign setting, and it kind of takes off from there, and lots of books get published for third edition, which is currently the game I'm running is an
Ah,
Eberron
there we go.
campaign, and yeah,
Excellent.
3.5,
Hmm, hmm.
and yeah, and actually the first time I got to know it was through quite a popular computer game, Dungeons and Dragons Online.
Absolutely.
Were
And
you
the funny thing
involved
is,
in? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
well, yes and no. The funny thing is that was the second Eberron computer game. There was
Oh,
a game
really?
called Dragon Shard
Huh?
that was a real-time strategy game. And that
Right.
was a much smaller thing. I think it was put out by Atari,
Hmm.
but it was out there, and I worked on that.
Hmm.
Um, D&D Online, I did not work directly on.
No.
I've certainly had conversations with the people working on it, and I will definitely say I was very impressed. During the sort of fourth edition days, there
Hmm.
really wasn't much official coming out for Eberron,
No.
and I feel the D&D Online team were really the people who were sort of creating new stories, and that definitely were doing a lot of interesting sort of delves into the lore. So I'm
Yeah.
really glad that was out there.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine. It kind of kept the flame going
Exactly.
for the
Yep.
campaign setting. Yeah, cool.
Mhm.
So yeah, one of my Patreon supporters, a guy called Thomas, he said I usually ask them. So, is there anything you would like me to ask my guests? And
Mhm.
he said, yeah. He said he's really looking forward to this particular interview because he's interested in world building.
Mhm.
And his very specific question is, you in your world has a lot of unique features and unique races,
Mhm.
but there's also elves and dwarves and humans. And his question very specifically is, do you think Eberron would be as successful if it didn't have the typical, let's say, fantasy trope races like
Mhm. Mhm.
dwarves and elves? Or yeah, so it's a kind of
Certainly.
hmm,
So the thing about it is that with Eberron, that was never really an option
no.
because of the circumstances of how it was created.
Mhm.
Eberron was something created for Wizards of the Coast, and basically part of the idea is one sort of had the sense that Wizards wasn't going to want to push, they were looking for something to be a sort of central setting for
Mhm.
D&D,
Yeah.
and that meant they weren't looking for something that was going to say we'll throw out half of the player's handbook.
Right. Yeah.
Elves, dwarves, all of that, they're in the player's handbook. And so with Eberron, what I tried to do was not throw things out,
Hmm.
but basically say, but can we make these different? Can we
Right.
find a way to make these interesting and engaging?
Yeah.
I'll say one of my favorites is the gnomes of Eberron, where gnomes had very, traditionally been very much sort of comic relief or ignored.
Yeah.
And in Eberron, they are basically ruthless spies and assassins, and they're pretty scary.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, the elves of Eberron are very different from traditional elves. You have the Arini, who basically preserved their ancestors and are sort of ruled by this undying court.
Hmm.
And then the Pteranodal, who are essentially the most dangerous and aggressive warrior culture.
Yeah.
And so again, as I said, it was about saying, if we're going to have these in, how is it not just Forgotten Realms? How do you make these feel compelling,
Hmm.
even to people who have played elves and dwarves for decades?
Yeah.
Now, having said that, and again, to me, this is part of Eberron, was just that this idea. What we say is, if it's in D&D, there is a place for it in Eberron. Not that it's necessarily there,
Mhm.
but that the world has enough flexibility. You can always add a Loxodon into, oh, they came from Zendrick. There's a lot of entry points.
Yeah.
So players can decide, if you don't want to use elves in your campaign, don't, but
Yeah.
they are in the world.
Mhm.
So the twist is that's because I knew I was making a world for Dungeons and Dragons,
Yeah.
for Wizards of the Coast. And so it did need to have those things.
Hmm.
If you're creating an entirely new world,
Hmm.
then it really does come, the very first thing I always say is, what is the story of your world? Sum it up in 1 to 2 sentences. And why do I want to play in it? There's so many settings out there. There's so many ideas. What is it about your idea that is different, that makes me say, oh, that's a story I want to tell? If it's just, oh, it's a fantasy world, but this one doesn't have dwarves.
Yeah.
I could play Game of Thrones if that's what I was looking for,
Yeah, exactly.
And so if your core idea is compelling,
Hmm.
then that's where I don't really care if you have elves or dwarves, if you
Yeah.
see what I'm saying, if I'm
Yeah.
interested
Hmm.
in what you are telling me.
Yeah.
I think the thing about the core fantasy races, elves, dwarves, etc., is it is easy for people to identify with. They've read Lord of the Rings, they've played some other version of D&D. It's easy for them to have that concept of, well, I want to play an elf.
Yeah.
If you drop them, you just need that question of what is compelling about your setting? What are the touchstones that will let people quickly come up with character ideas and see how they fit in?
Yeah.
So I certainly think it's more than possible. There are a lot of good fantasy settings that don't use those tropes.
Yeah.
Uh, but but it's back to the what is the idea that players can immediately latch onto, even if it doesn't convey all the depth of the setting. But what is the basic concept that gets people interested?
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the things I find difficult about certain, especially science fiction role-playing games, is that
Hmm.
they can be so alien, pardon the pun,
Yep.
yeah, exactly what you say there is, yeah, what do you latch on to? Because then most games will have some type of human,
Hmm.
and then suddenly it's weird insect creatures and that kind of stuff.
Right. And this is the thing is,
Mm,
one option is to go full human.
yeah.
Take, speaking of science fiction, something like The Expanse.
Yeah.
And it's just about humans. We
Yeah.
know humans. We understand what humans are about.
Yeah.
And part of the issue is if you use elves and dwarves, you have the fact that most people have a concept of what an elf or a dwarf is.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
you can twist that, which is what we did with Eberron. We're saying
Yeah.
we think you know what an elf is, but we're going to
Uh-huh.
add some wacky details.
Yeah.
But people still get it.
Yeah.
Whereas if instead I say my setting is about races that are solidified emotions, and
Mm.
there's the sad people and the angry people, at least there I get it. Oh, this guy's angry, but it's still, that's a much more abstract concept that you're asking people to grasp.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you need to make sure you've got something
Hmm.
that is accessible enough that people can at least latch on to that
Yeah.
and figure out the rest as they go.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That sounds like really good advice because, yeah, I've tried to create a setting of my own once
Mhm,
when I was running also again D&D third edition, and
mhm.
yeah, I started out kind of what you said. So there's a very simple, in a few sentences, this is what's going on.
Right.
But then I decided, well, I'm not going to build all kinds of races and classes. It's just the stuff that's in the PHB, and that'll work for me.
Well, and because again, it's what kind of story are you trying to tell?
Yeah. Yeah.
What is the purpose? Do you need either to remove them or not to remove them?
Yeah.
One of the other things I will also say in for anyone out there, this is pretty basic world building 101 advice, but
Hmm.
still is uh, decide what your story is. Why do we want to play? Any role playing game is essentially a novel or a movie that we're going to create together.
Yeah.
And the basic question is, why would I pick this up? Why would I pay for a movie ticket to watch it? What is the core idea that draws me in?
Yeah.
Once you've got that, um, in some cases, depending what the world is, you need to develop the whole thing because
Yeah.
the story is about the entire world.
Mm.
On the other hand, in a lot of cases, you don't need the whole world to get started if
Yeah.
you're doing something at home, if you're not doing this to sell it.
Hmm.
And you can start by just saying, well, where is this set? This is in Sharn.
Yeah.
Well, let's just work on Sharn. What do people need to know? Who's in Sharn? Maybe there's dwarves here, but no one's ever
Mm.
met one,
Yeah. Yeah.
unless a player wants to play a dwarf. And then you figure out what the story is with dwarves.
Yeah.
That basically you can do the start with the immediate area that the first couple of adventures will take place,
Hmm.
and then expand on. We can say there's a grand empire that has conquered most of the world, but
Yeah.
you don't need the details about it until the adventurers actually run into imperial forces. So you don't have to have the Silmarillion
Yeah.
to get
Yeah.
started.
Yeah.
You have
Exactly.
to know the important things about the area that things begin.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Like if you look at the eventual map of that campaign that I ran so many years ago, it's
Hmm.
basically a map of the starting village and then
Hmm.
the journey they took, and everything around it is vague at
Right.
best.
And
Yeah.
that's the point, because you
Yeah.
don't necessarily need it to
No.
be completely detailed.
No.
One of the things people often ask me, how much detail is too much when
Hmm.
you come into world building? How deep do you go?
Yeah.
And my simple answer to that is, with anything you're writing, it's a religion, it's a piece of history, it's a something.
Yeah.
Can you tell me 3 ways that you could imagine that thing playing into a venture?
Hmm.
It could be a character background. It could
Yeah.
be the bad guy comes from this culture. It could be we need to know this piece of history because you need to know it to defeat the villain.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, but can you give me at least 2 or 3? This is how this would come into a story.
Yeah.
And if you can't think of why any player is actually ever going to care about this thing you're creating,
Hmm.
then that's too deep.
Yeah. Ah, that's very nice. Yeah, because that's kind of the trap, right? A lot of people they start
Absolutely.
writing and they never finish it because it's, oh
Right.
wait, but there's this tiny village on the edge of blah blah, and I need to know the name of its blacksmith. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I will actually take a step farther of, it
Mm.
depends what you are doing. If you were creating for publication,
Yeah.
you need to create all these details because not every game master is comfortable creating them yourselves.
Yeah.
If what you're doing is creating a world for your table at home,
Mm.
for your friends that you're playing with, I always encourage people to actually bring the players in on that creation process.
Yeah.
That, again, this isn't just about you, this is about us building a story together that none of us would have alone.
Yeah.
So I will say that a campaign I've run a couple of times over the last 2 years, um, because I'll basically, sort of like running the same adventure, I'll run
Mhm.
the same starting point and groups will go different places. But
Yeah.
I've started this campaign with 3 different groups of people.
Mhm.
And part of it is it's a tiny village on the edge, on the frontier. It's a mining village in the nation of Kabara, where people are sort of a gold rush trying to get these precious dragon shards.
Yeah.
And the first thing I did in this sort of session 0, everyone comes in. I've
Mhm.
told people, tell me why you're in this village.
Yeah.
And I've also said the village needs a sheriff, the village needs a preacher.
Yeah.
If any of you want to be that character, basically you can either take that job or I will make an NPC who
Yeah.
has that job. So you can be the sheriff or you'll have to deal with the sheriff who I
Yeah.
create. And that's up to you.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
first off, give them a chance to invest in the setting.
Mm.
And then I basically started the session off saying, I want each of you to tell me about one inhabitant of the village that you have an interesting relationship with.
Yeah.
It could be a child, it could be a rival, it could be a lover,
Mhm.
but tell me about someone in the village you care about.
Yeah.
And I also said there's only one inn
Mm.
in the village.
Yeah.
Each of you tell me one detail about the inn.
Right.
And I've told the story before, but basically, like, one of them says it's got great acoustics and an open mic night.
Oh
One of
yeah.
them says they brew their own beer in the basement. One of
Mm.
them says they make the best biscuits in the in town. Everyone's
Yeah.
like, this is great. The last guy says they don't have a working toilet and it stinks.
Oh.
And everyone was like, why'd you do that to our inn? And well, I said, well, a cleansing stone, a magical toilet, costs about 200 gold pieces.
Ah.
And basically, they spent the next 3 adventures trying to raise enough money to buy a toilet for the bar.
That's so cool.
And the point of all that is, what I'm saying is, I didn't figure out who the bartender, what the name of the bartender was. I asked
Yeah.
them to figure it out,
Yeah. Yeah.
because then they care. If
Yeah.
all the details come out of my head alone,
Mm.
the players don't really have a reason. It doesn't feel like their story.
Yeah.
Whereas the more, you don't have to ask them to make up the whole thing,
No,
but
no,
just
no.
giving them ownership of parts of it,
Mm.
asking them to think about a few critical details
Yeah.
makes them see it in their mind. And it's not just you telling them about it, it's them helping make it. So
Yeah.
I highly recommend that.
Wow, that sounds like a great idea. Yeah, and so you mentioned so basically to start off a campaign setting, you need kind of this one sentence that says this is what it is and this is
Mhm.
why you should want to play it. So, what would you say is that sentence for Eberron?
Well, I can say exactly what that sentence is
Yeah,
for Eberron,
I'm sure you
because
can.
again, that was part of the requirement. It
Yeah, yeah.
was Lord of the Rings meets Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Maltese Falcon.
Okay.
And I think I added in, I can't remember the second sentence, was essentially saying a world in which magic has been integrated into everyday life.
Yeah, yeah,
But yeah, that was the initial pitch.
yeah. And so Raiders of the Lost Ark, that kind of brings us to the pulp kind of aspect of the Eberron
Pulp
campaign world.
adventure.
Yeah,
And
pulp.
so exactly, Lord of the Rings,
Uh-huh.
traditional fantasy, but
Yeah,
then blend that with the pulp adventure of Raiders of the Lost Ark and the noir intrigue of the Maltese Falcon.
yeah,
And as I said, the second sentence said to the effect of magic is a part of everyday life, which is
yeah.
the other core aspect of Eberron.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
so it's basically saying this is D&D,
Hmm.
but it's going to be D&D that is both high adventure, a little shades of gray,
Uh-huh.
uncertainty, and that magic isn't just sort of off with wizards and ivory towers. It's actually integrated into daily life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And the cool thing about that, what I really like is because magic is such an everyday thing. Once it stops working, people get really freaked out.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. So the
yeah,
start
yeah.
of my campaign, for instance, was all the players were, or the characters were on a lightning train,
Hmm.
which then got kind of yeah, I suppose a terrorist attack, if you
Hmm.
want to call it that. So it crashed down into the jungle, sort of north of Sharn, and
No, that I
yeah,
will say one of my easy starting points that I've used a bunch of times is very similar. It's
mm.
it's essentially people on an airship going
Oh
to
yeah,
Stormreach.
yeah,
The airship gets hijacked.
yeah,
The players are thus the only people capable of trying to deal with the hijackers, so
yeah,
die hard on an airship.
yeah, yeah,
And but then at the end of the when they deal with that, nonetheless, it ends up crashing
yeah.
in actually in a mysterious land, I'll just
Mm.
say.
Yeah, yeah,
And essentially the players have to work together to deal with these limited resources
yeah,
and all of that. So no, I
yeah,
think
yeah,
that's a great
yeah,
basic premise.
yeah. And what's handy about it is you limit the space for a while. It's like this is where you are, and yeah,
And and I definitely I feel with groups there's two ways to do it. The
mm.
first is to tell the group ahead of time, we're going, your characters do know each other. Figure
Yeah,
that out.
yeah,
What are your connections?
mm.
And that's part of what in Rising from the Last War, the fifth edition Eberron book,
Mm.
we introduced the idea of group patrons. And
Yeah,
group patrons, the whole point is to decide as a group of adventurers to say, we are all detectives. We are all a military unit. We
yeah,
are all working for the Church of the Silver Flame. So
yeah,
put people on the same page.
mm.
If you're not going to do that, if you're not going to say from the start, we're putting you all together,
Yeah,
something like your strangers on a train terrorist attack
mm.
is a way to say, we're going to put you through something
Yeah,
where you have to work together if you want to survive.
yeah,
And by the time you've done that, well, now you've saved each other's lives a couple times, and
yeah,
now you're in this mysterious city. If you're all strangers to Sharn,
yeah,
might as well stick together.
yeah, yeah,
It's a good way to have that form organically, rather than we all answer to help wanted ad, and
yeah, yeah,
this guy's offering us 10 gold pieces to find a sword.
yeah, yeah.
That's not
Exactly.
really that interesting a story.
No, no. Yeah, one of my favorite bits about that was that one of the players he decided he wanted to play a Warforged
Mhm,
character, which I think the other players were not that familiar with that race.
mhm.
So we decided he was actually an older model, and he was
Nice.
dug up somewhere, and
Mhm.
so he was actually in a crate at the beginning of the game.
That's great.
Yeah, yeah, it was a lot of fun. Um, yeah, and so we talked a bit about how you get from basically your own homebrew small size thing all the way up to a published campaign. And like
Mhm.
you mentioned, for fifth edition now, there's one book out and there's one book coming, right? Which is Exploring Eberron.
So that's correct.
Yeah.
So there is Rising from the Last Wars out. I am
Hmm.
working on a book called Exploring Eberron
Yeah.
now, which hopefully will be out in March.
Okay.
I will say that that is not an official book. This
Oh.
is it's for the DMs Guild. This
Uh-huh.
is just things I've wanted to write about in Eberron for the last 15 years, and
Right.
there's never been an opportunity to write about them in an official book. So
Mhm.
things like the plains, things like the goblins,
Yeah.
so this is more of a Keith's favorite things,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it is not actually sort of. I'm not doing it with Wizards of the Coast.
Uh,
It's just being done through the DM's Guild.
yeah. Okay. So that's where people will be able to find it in
Yes, correct.
March.
It will
Okay.
be print on demand,
Uh-huh.
so
Oh, that's
so you
cool.
can
Yeah.
get, and it's going to be a 200-page book. I mean, it's a
Right.
big book,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it will be through the DM's Guild.
Okay. Cool. And can you lift like a tiny little edge of the
Mhm.
what do you call it? The blanket? No.
Curtain.
Well, curtain. Yeah.
Certain.
Sorry.
Yeah. Well, as I said, it's
Hmm.
it's things that I've wanted to talk about that just never have been talked about in much detail. So the
Yeah.
planes are certainly an example.
Hmm.
Eberron has its own unique planar cosmology, but we've
Yeah.
really given very little detail, and you haven't really had enough to make adventures that
No.
tie to them. So
No.
there's a
Yeah.
whole chapter on the planes.
Cool. Yeah.
There's chapters on other parts of Eberron that just haven't been explored in much detail. One of
Uh-huh.
them, I'll say, is the oceans, the
Right.
undersea
Yeah.
civilizations.
Yeah.
Swagan, Merfolk, how do those actually fit into the world?
Yeah.
There's also just more information about the religions, about the unique races,
Yeah.
so a lot of little different things.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Sounds good. And somewhere in March, then we can pick that
Yep.
up. So
Hmm.
if you let me know, but around then
Oh, I
I'll
will.
post a link on my page. Yeah,
Absolutely.
sure, great. Yeah, and the other thing you told me you're working on is completely something completely different. It's a card game, right?
That's correct. I'm
Mhm.
working on a card-based storytelling game tied to the Adventure Zone,
Uh-huh.
which I'm not sure if you're familiar with. It's a
Yep.
podcast of a live play podcast with the McElroy family,
Yeah, yeah.
and basically, what we're trying to do with the game is it's a game that helps you sort of create your own sort of adventures that feel like Adventure Zone stories.
Yeah.
So, in many ways, what it is we wanted something that gives you some of the experience of playing a role playing game,
Uh-huh.
but that is something you could play in an hour with pretty much anyone.
Okay.
Like you've got that friend who likes the idea of D&D but's never
Yeah.
played it before, and you
Uh-huh.
kind of don't want to dump them into the deep end. Well,
Yeah.
just dive into the Adventure Zone, and we'll give you a quick fun adventure.
Right. Okay. And what would you say is the main card mechanic? Like how does it work?
So basically, you are going on a mission,
Mhm.
and the mission is set up using decks of cards.
Hmm.
So there are 12 different decks.
Yeah.
You are choosing a villain, a relic, and a location. And then you lay those cards out, and that essentially dynamically generates, the
Hmm.
dungeon.
Yeah.
And you are trying to go through the deck,
Mhm.
progress down through the decks
Yeah.
to recover the relic and either defeat the villain or escape the location.
Okay.
But then a big part of the idea is that the cards present a general idea, but then it's up to you to add the details. So,
Okay.
one of the villain decks is the Lich. And
Yeah.
we're saying, okay, you're fighting the Lich, but then what you do at the start of the game is say, but who is this Lich?
Yeah.
Where is this cave? What is this ring that you're trying to get?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so we want you to sort of make it the story your own,
Hmm.
if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It
And the
does. Yeah.
cards set the core framework. Likewise, basically, when you try to defeat a challenge, ultimately what you are doing, each character has different strengths. You're picking the challenge, you're rolling a die, you're seeing if your number defeats it,
Uh,
and getting help from your friends potentially.
yeah.
At the same time, that's the core mechanic.
Yeah.
What we encourage is the whole point is how are you defeating it?
Yeah.
How are you engaging it? What are you trying to do?
Okay.
It's a little in that way like my card game Gloom, which I
Uh-huh.
don't know if you know, but the point of Gloom is that storytelling is a lot of what's fun about it,
Uh-huh.
but it does have a core mechanical foundation. You don't
Yeah.
have to tell stories if you're shy or nervous.
Yeah. Right. Okay. And so there's dice involved. Is it like a
Yes.
A D20 or a?
Well, it's funny
Uh,
because it is a D20,
hmm.
but it only goes from 1 to 6.
Oh.
So it is a D20 with 3 different sets of 1 to 6, and then it has a critical hit and an epic fail.
Ah.
And essentially, the game itself only needs a range of 1 to 6 to
Yeah.
sort of do what it does.
Uh-huh.
But because it's like, but you're playing like a role playing game, you got to
Yeah.
have a D20. So we have a big D20, but it only
Yeah.
goes from 1 to 6.
Oh wow! So it's a proprietary kind of dice that.
Yeah. It's a 20-sided D6.
Wow, that's
Um,
good. I would get it for just that dice alone.
I love the die,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's very fun because it's a big die,
yeah,
and it has that when you start off and you're like, okay, well we got one
yeah,
of these D20s because we're playing
yeah,
that kind of game. Oh, but it only goes to 6. And similarly, but again, it's
yeah,
got the critical hit and epic
yeah,
fail because at the same time, that's part of the experience. You
yeah. Of
want that
course.
moment where you're fighting against impossible odds, and
Yeah,
but you get the critical hit, woo!
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
Ah,
so, like I said, it is just something we came up with that just sort of ties to the flavor of the game
yeah,
and the whole fact that it's like a D&D like experience, but it is lighter and simpler and
yeah,
faster.
yeah.
And so there you are.
And I guess it could encourage people who've been playing D&D for a bit, who are mostly focused on the mechanics, that they could learn from this yeah, involve more story. Yeah,
Exactly right. And that's
yeah,
basically the point is a lot
mm,
of cards just basically give you prompts. They ask
yeah,
questions. You run into a bunch of goblins and it's going to say, well, what's it, if you give me an interesting fact about these goblins,
yeah.
you'll get a +1 to your roll.
Okay.
And so it's just, again, a sort of way of just saying, you can tell
Yeah,
more. And
yeah.
this is something I've suggested both. I made a role playing game called Phoenix Dawn Command,
Hmm.
but I also suggest in Rising from the Last War of basically like if you're in a bar fight, what I will do is actually put out on the table a short list of things in the bar.
Yeah,
There's a chandelier, there's a roaring fireplace, there's a
yeah,
tray of drinks, there's
yeah.
a plate glass window. And I'll give players, bonuses, advantage, some
Mm,
other effect if they
yeah,
come up with a clever way to use one of those things.
yeah, yeah,
Because basically, all of those are things that would be in a bar,
yeah,
but people don't necessarily stop and think. You're just like, oh, I hit him, I rolled the die, I do
yeah,
5 points of damage. And if you
yeah,
stop and think, but yeah, are you going to shove him into the fireplace? Or are you going to knock him into a tray of drinks?
yeah,
That makes it feel more real. And I
yeah.
find most players will do that and have a lot of fun with it
Hmm.
if they just are encouraged
Yeah,
to do it.
yeah, yeah,
But if you don't have that encouragement there, people just, as I said, don't stop to think what would be around me in this space.
yeah, yeah. Exactly. Yeah, yeah. I try to do that in some of my encounters. I put things that I think, well, they should be there anyway, but I kind of in my description uh, give it a little bit of attention, and you can tell with a lot of players they're like, "Ooh, hold on, maybe," and that alone makes them more engaged, I think, with the whole thing. And it sounds like this Adventure Zone card game could also be used as a means to generate adventures if you're just writing
Oh,
stuff
sure.
into the GM. Yeah.
Yeah, no reason it couldn't be.
Hmm, cool. And when can we find this in stores near us?
We just completed our pre-order in January. We are hoping to have it out at Gen Con, so
Ah,
August.
okay, okay. This
It's a
summer.
little while still. It's in development.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Wow. And is there any place we can follow the how it's going with this
Oh
game? Is
yeah,
there?
it's the website is
Ah, okay.
theadventurezonegame.com.
Yeah.
And you can always check my website is keith-baker.com. And my company is Together Studios, TWO Gether.
Yeah.
And any of those places, will
Okay.
certainly have news when it's
Yeah.
available. My website, keithbaker.com, I do a lot of Eberron
Yeah.
articles and such
Uh-huh.
there. So that's something to check out if you like Eberron.
Yeah, I'll definitely link to those things in the show notes once we're done here. And so this Together Studios, I read a little bit about it. So this is something that you co-founded together with your wife, right?
That's correct.
That's so wonderful to be able to work on something that is so near and dear to your heart with the person
Oh no,
who's, yeah.
yeah,
That's,
absolutely. It's something I'm very I'm thrilled about.
yeah.
We have different strengths. I'm more of a story developer. and she is both a very good sort of UI design, graphic, visuals, as well as being an excellent, designer, but sort of coming at it from a different place than me.
Yeah.
So we very much sort of complement each other
Okay.
on what we bring to the table.
Yeah. Great. That's wonderful. So, one thing that I ask all of my guests is the whole point of my podcast is that I try to speak to people that I consider to be to have done something really cool for the hobby of role playing games, you included. So I would consider you a role playing game
Well, thank you.
hero. Yeah, and
I'm
so.
honored.
Well, I'm glad, and I'm honored that you're willing to take the time to speak to me. My podcast being quite tiny as it is at the moment. Yeah, and so I'm wondering who would be your role playing game hero.
Well, there's certainly many people I could name.
Hmm.
Just when I was starting off,
Hmm.
many people who were inspirational, who helped out. I'll just start by saying Matt Forbeck
Hmm.
was someone who gave me a lot of excellent advice when I was just starting out.
Right.
But if I sort of had to pick, one person who I really feel sort of inspired me and whose work generally always inspires me,
Hmm.
I would say Robin Laws.
Okay.
And I first encountered him through the role playing game Over the Edge,
Hmm.
which was created by John Nephew and Jonathan Tweet.
Okay.
Again, also people who I respect a lot. That
Yeah.
was the first game I actually did any professional writing for.
Ah.
And
Okay.
Robin Laws did one of my favorite game mechanics, which is called the cut ups method.
Okay.
And On the Edge is a game that normally uses dice, or Over the Edge, excuse me, normally uses dice.
Uh-huh.
With the cut ups method, you take it for a situation where it seems like using dice is just not going to have either the room for creativity or
Hmm.
really the narrative weight that you're looking for.
Right.
And so instead of rolling dice, the game master grabs a book and just picks out 4 random words.
Hmm.
Flip the pages, just take the first 4 words that catch your attention,
Okay.
give those to the player, and the player has to use those words to describe what they are doing. Like,
Wow.
take a moment and come up with about a paragraph
Mhm.
describing your action.
Yeah.
So the kinds of things I would use this for are: you're trying to do a magical ritual,
Yeah.
you're a mad scientist and you're trying to build a crazy device.
Yeah.
And part of the point is I just don't want to know just sort of, don't just give me the number, tell me how you're doing it. I
Yeah.
think my favorite experience I ever had with the cutouts method was a player who ended up, it's a long story, but getting
Mhm.
into a karaoke duel to the death. And
Okay.
so I gave her cut-ups methods, and the
Yeah.
player on the spot composed a song that she
Wow.
sang.
Oh, really?
And
Oh.
yeah, and I was just like, again, it was so much better than just saying, well, roll your perform check,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but that, as I said, is sort of the key. Like, that's Robin Laws in a nutshell to me.
Yeah.
But he has done so many different games: Feng Shui, Hill Folk, and sort of everything he does. I've just really liked the way in which he sort of tries to draw in storytelling and
Mm.
tries to sort of look beyond just the simple concrete
Yeah.
rules. So
Okay.
yeah, he's
Oh,
definitely been an inspiration to me.
great. Oh, that's a wonderful answer. Yeah. So I'll have a look and see if I can find him and maybe his website and
Absolutely.
link to those. Yeah.
Well, thank you very
Wonderful.
much.
Well, I guess that kind of takes us to the end already of this interview. Yeah. So I definitely want to thank you for your time. It's wonderful to speak to somebody with such a creative mind and yeah, who's created a setting that I've been playing in now for I think it's about 1.5, almost 2 years, and
Well, I'm
yeah,
glad you're enjoying it.
yeah, definitely, yeah.
And yeah, thank you for having me.
Okay, great. And once the new Adventure Zone card game comes out, give me a shout, and I'll let my listeners know all about it and see if
I
we
will.
can use it in our sessions. All right, wonderful. Well, I'll let you go. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
And that was the interview. And once again, I'm amazed by how generous my RPG heroes are with their time and also with sharing lots and lots of information and insights into how they do what they do. The main things that I found very interesting in this interview is when you want to do world building, that it's a very good idea to know your players and to try and involve them in the world building process, so that you also have a world that they are invested in and that they really want to play in. Another thing is before you start designing a certain feature of your world, such as a place, a religion, a specific set of NPCs, etc., think of 3 ways in which people will use it in-game. And if you can't come up with any kind of fun way to use it in-game, well, then perhaps it's not worth putting your time into. Related to the question of Thomas, my patron supporter, when you're creating a world, think about the tropes of the genre involved. Because as much as tropes are something that you don't want to overuse, they do offer players and game masters something to latch on to help with immersion and to get to grips with your world. I think the main question that Keith poses when he wants to create a world is, what is the story of your world and why do I want to play in it? And I think that's a great question to start off with. And as I also experienced myself, just create what you need. Don't overdo it. Don't try to create a Google Maps level of information of your game world if you don't actually need every single inch of it. One last thing that we didn't cover in the interview, but that I found out when I was researching Keith as a guest, is that apparently he has a tattoo of the greater mark of making, which is something from the Eberron world. It's on his right arm. And I have a question to you, my listeners. What RPG-related tattoos do you have, if you have any? Please share a picture of them on my Facebook page or on my Instagram page. I'm very curious. And that's it for episode 5. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed recording. If you did, please consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. It really helps to get the podcast get heard. Want to keep up with the latest news about my podcast? Then hop on over to my Facebook page on facebook.com/RPG Heroes Podcast. Check out the full show notes with all the links at rpgheroes.buzzsprout.com. Want to support the show and join other supporters on my Discord channel? Then I would be honored if you check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/rpgheroes. 2 weeks from now, I'll be delving into maps with the help of YouTuber Nate from the WASD20 channel. Until next time, stay heroic.